Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson with the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment, also known as SMA. So today's our first event of our INSS PRISM series, hosted here on SMA's virtual platform. So today we have a session entitled Geoeconomics and the Emerging World Order, the Power of the US Dollar, which is featuring the Honorable Jack Lew, who's the former Secretary of the Treasury. So before we begin, I have a few quick housekeeping items. We'll be having a virtual Q&A session at the conclusion of the discussion. So throughout the brief or throughout the initial discussion or during the Q&A, feel free to submit your questions via the live event Q&A chat. It's a chat icon and it has 2 overlapping speech bubbles and 1 has a question mark. Also be sure to type in your name and affiliation before your question. And if you're an NDU faculty member, please make sure to specify that in your question. Also, if you'd prefer for your name to not be recorded, feel free to submit your question anonymously. And feel free to also vote on the questions that you would want addressed most by hitting the like button next to each of the questions. So now I'm going to briefly turn the floor over to today's moderator, Mr. Michael McLaughlin, for kicking off the session. So Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Welcome to, this is actually the 3rd session of the INSS PRISM web seminars for NDU faculty and NDU friends. This session is co-organized by the Eisenhower School for National Security and Resource Strategy, and the first session brought to you on the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment platform. Please note that this session is being recorded for future classroom use. When we discuss power in international relations, we often refer to the diplomacy, information, military, economic, or DIME paradigm. But analysis frequently defaults automatically to the military element of national strength. This series explores the other elements of national power, that is economic, information, and diplomatic. For this session, we're fortunate to have the Honorable Jack Lew, the 76th United States Secretary of the Treasury from 2013 to 2017, who also served as the 25th White House Chief of Staff from 2012 to 2013, and Director of the Office of Management and Budget in both the Clinton and Obama administrations. This session will take the form of a dialogue with Secretary Lew on the power of the US dollar as a tool in the national security toolbox. I'll begin the session with a series of questions for the Secretary, but the final 45 minutes until we adjourn at 13:30 will be open for questions from you. Before we begin, please allow me to thank my colleagues at the Eisenhower School and the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment team. Thank you for your partnership. Mr. Secretary, if we can start with the basics, what are the unique attributes of a dominant global reserve currency that make the US dollar such a potent force in the national security toolbox?
Oh, Secretary, you're on mute.
Sorry about that.
Perfect.
It's good to be with you, Michael. And let me start with the positive. Being the world's reserve currency gives us enormous capacity to aid our own fiscal options and our trade options in a way that strengthens our economy and our country. One of the reasons that the United States has the ability to borrow as much as it needs to at a moment like this during a pandemic, when other countries might have to think harder about it, is that when you're the world's reserve currency, there's a depth and liquidity of the markets for your securities that's just different than if you're not the world's reserve currency. It doesn't mean we should be irresponsible about our fiscal policy, and we can get to that later. But at a moment like this, it means we have as good as unlimited ability to meet our immediate needs. That's a source of real strength. Not every country has that. In terms of trade, the fact that goods and services around the world are transacted in dollars creates a centrality to the US economy for the purpose of doing business, of financing commercial enterprises. And that, again, is a source of enormous strength for our economy, and it gives us a positive kind of influence domestically and internationally. In terms of the power of the dollar as the world's reserve currency, it gives us the ability, when we need to for our national security reasons, to project our views through sanctions and other mechanisms to command the attention of other countries. We'll get into the detail of how sanctions regimes work and what, in my view, makes them more or less effective. But the being the largest economy in the world and being the world's reserve currency means that if you can't do business with the United States or transact business in our currency, it is a serious burden for the party that faces those restrictions. As we'll get into in more detail, I think that's a powerful tool that has to be used with great judgment and care in order for it to maintain that strength. But those are all attributes that are associated with something that, I would say in earlier times wasn't given a lot of thought as a strategic tool. It was thought of as just an economic tool. And my view is one has to think about it as a strategic tool and husband its use and protect its durability so that it will be there not just now, but in the future. And there are a lot of parallels in terms of how I think the tool should be used to the way I think military planners think about using military tools.
Mr. Secretary, could you, in fact, just go into a little bit more detail on the specific techniques that the U.S. has utilized to deploy the dollar in support of foreign and national security policy?
Okay, again, I'll start with the positive. When there's a financial crisis, we can create liquidity in dollars in another economy by actions that we take as a government or through our central bank, the Federal Reserve Board. When we disapprove of the policies of another country, we have the ability to limit through a variety of statutory sanctions authorities, whether or not individual entities in a country or that other nation itself can trade with the United States. We can choose whether to carve out exceptions to that for things like food and medical supplies. And we have the ability, by opening and closing our markets to trade, to create access to or block access from the world's largest markets. These give you the ability to have leverage to drive policy discussions in other countries. I think one thing we have to remember is that whenever you're talking about using these tools, you're talking about what does it take to get a foreign sovereign to change a policy that for its own reasons it's already decided are in the national interest of that country. It's not a neutral territory. Whether it's Iran or North Korea or fill in the blank for the country that's subject to sanctions, they've made a decision on what their national policy and their national interest is. When we apply a sanctions regime, what we're saying is we're going to inflict a burden on your economy, and the only way to relieve that burden is to change the policy that we object to. And I've said this before, but I think it's worth repeating that I think there are three really central lessons as to how sanctions can be used effectively. One is, notwithstanding the unique position of the United States, we're always better off if sanctions are done with broad support of other countries, of like-minded countries. And I'll come back to why I think that's important. Now, that doesn't mean ever relinquishing your right to act unilaterally when that's what you need to do in your national interest. But the leakage and the difficulty of implementation grow considerably when you are acting unilaterally. And there are questions ultimately that come into play in terms of whether or not it's an appropriate or inappropriate use of our unique position. Secondly, If we impose sanctions for the express purpose of getting a government to change a policy, you are doing X, unless you stop doing X or reverse X, these sanctions will stay in place. The corollary of that is we must remove the sanctions when the action is taken, because the goal of the sanction is not primarily to cause pain. But in fact, you often try to avoid causing pain to the citizens of another country because the goal is not to have people hate the United States. The goal is to get the sovereign to change their policy. It's like collateral damage in war. You try to limit it. But if you're not prepared to lift the sanctions when a foreign sovereign changes its policies in order to get that response, query whether sanctions can ever work to change policy, or do they become simply a tool of inflicting pain, not a way of achieving a strategic objective. And third, there has to be the ability to implement sanctions effectively, both in terms of our domestic systems, having the ability to track the transactions by a specific party or a country who has been named as a sanctioned entity, but also to get other countries to cooperate with us. And I'll give you an example of where that is so critical. If you're trying to put a sanction on the importation of oil, there's a lot of seas that oil travels over. There's a lot of places that oil can be transshipped. There's a lot of ways to escape the sanctions through either reflagging or transshipping. If you don't have cooperation, the effectiveness of your effort will be substantially reduced. I think the danger of seeing sanctions in the kind of narrow sense of how much pain can we inflict, I think is a real one. We have the ability to inflict considerable pain by denying access to transactions in dollars or markets where either we control access or those who would not risk losing access to our markets will honor our wishes. But unless it's tied to a strategy for how to accomplish the change, and there's a willingness to relieve the sanctions if the policy changes, all it is a tool to inflict pain. So to put it in a broader context, if you think of sanctions being implemented primarily, not exclusively by the Treasury Department, there are some sanctions that are implemented by the State Department, some by the Commerce Department. You think about those tools, they all have to be in service of a foreign policy objective. And there has to be an engagement, really a negotiation, either directly or indirectly, for the foreign sovereign to understand clearly how it needs to change its policies in order to have the sanctions relieved. And in the absence of that, it becomes a much blunter instrument and one less likely to deliver the desired end result, and also one that could cause the United States to be seen in a less favorable light and cause a loss of our stature in many ways, which we can come back to.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. During your tenure as Secretary of the Treasury, can you describe how the use of sanctions, designations, and the other tools that were at your disposal, how did those tools evolve during your tenure?
So we use the sanctions quite aggressively on a number of instances. Certainly in the case of Iran, to get Iran to agree to wind down its nuclear program, there was a ratcheting up of sanctions, and it involved a combination of legislation providing expanded authority, but also the execution of measures, sanctioning measures to implement that. I mean, I think one of the kind of interesting conflicts or tensions, I would say, not conflicts, the legislative branch has to give the executive branch the tools. It's not always clear that the legislative branch will be as comfortable with the decision to roll back a sanction as it needs to be for sanctions to be effective, or as sensitive to the diplomatic cross currents that require sometimes compromises to be made in how sanctions are used. So just to put some meat on the bones, if you go back to a debate in 2009 over new sanctions to put pressure on Iran, the original design legislatively would have subjected countries that we needed cooperation from to likely sanction effects. Now, if at that moment, Russia and China were potentially partners in putting pressure on Iran, we had a lengthy negotiation with Congress to carve out a pathway to have that support from Russia and China. And it manifested itself in the case of China with a differential rate of reductions required of imported oil. The immediate cessation of oil exports from Iran to China would have been devastating to China's economy. Having a percentage reduction that put real pressure on Iran was a way of getting getting China into the group of countries putting pressure on Iran, even though in just nominal measurement, one could have put more immediate dollar pressure on Iran. And I would personally argue that the configuration of the P5+1 negotiation that led to the peace, to the nuclear agreement with Iran probably would not have worked out without the broad multilateral support that it had. We can get into a conversation as to whether it was a good or a bad agreement, whether we're in a better or worse place with the United States withdrawing from it. I think my bias on that is pretty clear, having been part of the team that agreed to pressed for and agreed to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. I think we were in a stronger position in many ways with it. I'm talking about just the dynamic of how do you get a country like Iran to a negotiating table to agree to change its policy. That kind of balance. And I think that, in some ways, it's a helpful tool for the executive to be able to point to the Congress saying, look, they want to do things that are even tougher, that don't give us the ability to roll them back when we need to not have exceptions that give us the ability to bring other countries on board. So there's a little, good cop, bad cop is a little simplistic, but there is a little bit of that in the relationship between Congress and the executive, typically. I would look at the sanctions regime on Russia as being a rather significant development. Now, recall that the sanctions that we imposed for the bulk of the Obama administration were associated with Russia's activities in Ukraine, particularly its seizure of Crimea and its support, if not occupation, of Donetsk and Luhansk in the east of Ukraine. We then and now considered this a violation of international law. We considered it a threat to sovereignty. And we took a very clear position that we were going to use the economic tools we had to put pressure on Russia, in the first instance to stop where it was, in the second instance to come to a negotiation, and ultimately, hopefully, we haven't gotten to it, a withdrawal which restores at least most of the original sovereignty of Ukraine. We had an extended debate in the design of those sanctions as to whether we should emerge with everything we could do in the first instance or do it in a more measured way. We had a real challenge because just where the world was at that moment, we were emerging from the Great Recession. Europe was having a harder time landing on its feet than the United States. For sanctions against Russia to be effective, it was critical to have European cooperation. We also were not in such a solid position in the United States economically, that were we to cause a recession in Europe, we had no assurance there wouldn't be spillover into it's our largest trading partner. That was the principal risk of a second wave of recession in the United States. We went about designing what I believe are the most surgical sanctions that have ever been designed. And I was very proud that within the Treasury Department, for the first time, it called upon all of the expertise of the department in terms of understanding the wiring of international flows of funds and currency, and bank positions that would or wouldn't be destabilized with different actions, both internationally and domestically, and how to get at the players who we wanted to feel the pressure the most. Now, doctrinally, there's a question of should you come with everything or should you show that you can ratchet up the pressure if you don't get a response? You know, my view pretty strongly is starting with everything gives you nowhere to go. And if one of the real advantages to economic sanctions is that it expands the toolkit for policymakers to delay the use of need to revert to the use of force, I think it's actually quite important to keep an escalation model so that you can tell a party this is going to hurt, and it's going to hurt more and more and more, as opposed to come with everything, and if it doesn't work, the next conversation is, do we provide arms or do we provide troops? Or do we just say we can't change the situation, which would mean failing completely? We designed sanctions in the first instance that got directly to the circle around the leadership in the Kremlin, the bank where many of them banked, the businesses that they were most closely tied to. As the occupation expanded, we grew the sanctions list to include more of the strategic industries that supported the effort and to get more deeply into the Russian economy. All the while, keeping an eye on what the retaliation would be on Europe and whether it was likely to cause the kind of weakening of resolve in Europe that would make it more difficult to stick with the sanctions program. We did not want to have sanctions that were perceived by the Russian people as being aimed at them. We thought that would be counterproductive at a moment when the leadership in Russia was making it a kind of a matter of nationalist fervor. We didn't need to feed that narrative. We wanted to stand on principle, hold accountable the policymakers. So, for example, we could have found a way to shut down intercity transportation through the rail system and its exposure to sanctions. That would have been crushing to the Russian people. It didn't particularly affect the provision of material or support. So it would have been something that you would have done for the purpose of hurting the Russian people, and we chose not to do that. We went hard against the arms suppliers, hard against the energy producers and transmission lines, and put maximum pressure on the regime. Now, unlike Iran, where I would argue the sanctions worked, they brought the sovereign to the table. An agreement was reached. It was an agreement that all the parties at that time thought was an important step forward. And there was a decision to roll back the sanctions. A difficult decision because in the case of Iran, Iran was doing many bad things other than developing nuclear weapons. Iran continues to do many bad things other than developing nuclear weapons. But we had to distinguish the sanctions that were designed to get Iran to roll back its nuclear program from the other sanctions and provide some relief. Otherwise, there was no lever to use to reach an agreement. If at the end, because Iran was still participating in regional destabilization and supporting terrorism, all of the sanctions remained in place, there would have been no even logic for an agreement. I think we threaded that needle quite well and can go into some of the detail if we choose to, but that was one scenario where I would say sanctions worked. In Russia, the jury is still out. The situation is not ultimately resolved. And I think one could mistakenly claim success or declare failure too early. I think in terms of freezing the conflict, it succeeded. There was no evidence that Russia was stopping where it was, and it did stop. There was no peace process. The Minsk Accords were reached. They provide a diplomatic framework where ultimately, if there's further progress, there's a potential to resolve some of these issues diplomatically. Is there a final resolution that led to Russian withdrawal from either Crimea, Donetsk, or Luhansk? No. So kind of depending on how you measure, I would say that there was a moment of confusion at the change of administrations when even Congress felt that it had to compel the new administration to keep the pressure on. There's been ongoing confusion into the intentions of the current administration with regards to Russia. I'm not sure how you separate the sanctions from all the other things going on. As somebody who still believes it's important for the Ukraine issues to be negotiated and resolved, keeping the sanctions in place, I'd say we're not at the end of the story yet. And it may well be that at a future moment, there's ways of bringing the sanctions more effectively to bear to drive ongoing progress in the diplomatic frame.
Let's, if we can, let's just talk a little bit about the strategic impact of sanctions. You acknowledge, and you note rightly, that broadly applied sanctions could have a counterproductive effect on populations of countries where we don't want to alienate the population, and that smart sanctions allow us to be more precise and targeted. But what is their strategic impact? Countries, for example, like Russia, as you described, but also Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, have been financially isolated more than any other countries in the world, and yet we don't seem to have been able to change their behavior at a strategic level. How do you explain that?
Well, first of all, sanctions are not always effective. If a regime is willing to endure almost unlimited hardship on its people, the only thing that will ultimately drive them to change is fear of the survival of their regime, because the internal pressure becomes unbearable. In a totalitarian state, I don't know that that's a practical outcome until you get to a point that there are options that are far more deadly than economic tools that start to come into play. Let's take Venezuela and North Korea separately. In the case of North Korea, there was a pretty broad sense that they were willing to endure a lot of pain on their people. The only circle whose pain the leadership cared about was the chain of command to control the military and the government. And they could afford to keep that circle sufficiently satisfied that just causing pain more broadly in the economy of North Korea was not likely to lead to a change of policy. There was also, and I think still is, the reality that the principal economic lifeline for North Korea is China. And it's almost impossible to put maximum pressure on North Korea without China's involvement and cooperation. In terms of what we knew about the weapons program in North Korea, if you look over the 8 years of the Obama administration, it wasn't until the last year, really, that it became clear that they were starting to make meaningful progress on their nuclear capabilities. So there was a sense of more time. Now, that may have been that our intel wasn't good enough. We never have 100% visibility into these things, and it's a puzzle. At the point when we came to understand the more advanced stage of the North Korean nuclear program, we immediately went to the UN and pulled China in and had ratcheted up our bilateral relation pressure on China to cooperate on putting more pressure on the DPRK. We had an overlapping strategic interest in part. It isn't really in China's interest for North Korea to be a nuclear power that they don't fully control. On the other hand, their much more central strategic fear is a unified North Korea where we're essentially across the river from them as part of the security structure of the Republic of Korea, South Korea. I think the diplomatic approach we took, the very last trip that I sent my undersecretary on to China, in the last weeks of the administration, was to ratchet up the actions on the North Korea-China border. And we went to the UN and got the support of the Chinese for international sanctions. Just a sidebar, for a variety of reasons, some of them legitimate, some of them self-serving, China has a definite bias towards international versus unilateral sanctions. They don't really recognize the legitimacy of unilateral sanctions. Going through the UN gives you a mechanism to get the Chinese to be more willing to apply bilateral pressure. So one can put a bilateral sanction, U.S. against North Korea, in place. But if China doesn't buy in, if China doesn't limit the ability of either Chinese companies or cutouts of Chinese companies to facilitate trade on the border, because there's virtually no trade between the U.S. and North Korea, and the dollar is not a particularly significant part of the North Korean economic system, we don't have that many points of leverage. I think that the ability to put pressure on North Korea with China is much greater than the ability just alone. Our policy with regard to North Korea, in my view, has been quite confused over the last 3.5 years. Our policy with regard to China has been quite confused. One of the things with China that I think will always be necessary is you have to prioritize different concerns. You can't expect one of the two major powers of the world to respond equally to every concern you have at all times. We were transitioning in 2016 to putting North Korea way higher on the list than it had been earlier. We in 2012, 13, 14, when the timeline on the North Korea nuclear program was considerably longer, we had the desire to get China into the Iran negotiations. We had the desire to get China into the Paris climate negotiations. We had a huge set of bilateral issues, including the exchange rate of the dollar and the RMB that was being used to undermine U.S. Economic interests, and a host of other bilateral and transnational issues. My judgment at the transition 2016, 2017, North Korea jumped to the top of the list because of the change in North Korea's posture. I think if that had been prioritized over a trade war, you would have been able to get more cooperation from China, putting the kind of pressure on North Korea that could be effective. And I think, conversely, by having a kind of odd bilateral negotiation with North Korea that has the whole world turning their heads as to what the U.S. is trying to accomplish and why we're doing what we're doing, makes it much more challenging to get a country to do something that it's hard for it to do under the best of circumstances. Venezuela is a different case. Venezuela is a very small, very cut-off economy. And my view on Venezuela has changed several times. When I was at Treasury, I was persuaded that we did not have enough direct access to Venezuela's economy to have a huge impact directly. What I came to understand, and where I will give credit to the current administration for using a sanctions tool in a creative way, was that while it was a small percentage of the total trade with Venezuela, it was a relatively high percentage of their liquidity. You know, a lot of their trade with Russia didn't give them the ability to buy goods and services anywhere else in the world. They weren't getting a liquid currency. They weren't even necessarily getting cash. They could have been getting credit. And where I will fault the current administration is it didn't have a strategic frame for how to apply that tool in the context of a diplomatic approach that could affect change in a meaningful way. So even if you find that fulcrum, you have the ability to use a lever, you still have to use the sanctions lever in the context of a broader strategy. And I've not seen that follow through in the case of Venezuela.
The Trump administration has used sanctions and designations very publicly. What is your assessment of the risk of the overuse of these kinds of tools?
So as you know, Michael, I've given this a lot of thought, and I've written about this some. I think the combination of our the United States' aggressive posture over the last 3.5 years on trade and sanctions raises some real warning signals. It is not a great thing to be seen as a bully around the world. It's not a great thing to be seen as unpredictable and often confusing national security and economic interests. I've written on this and I've spoken on this. There are legitimate concerns about the strategic risks of China's technology becoming part of the backbone of communications of the United States and other global allies. I'm not an expert in the technology. I can't opine on whether it's a risk that can be mitigated or not, but I will stipulate that there's a legitimate risk that warrants serious consideration. What I don't think makes any sense at all is to claim that something is a serious national security risk, but then to enter into a trade negotiation where you say, if you buy more from us, we'll relax the restrictions on that technology. Those are different issues. I spent a lot of time at the Treasury Department defending our use of the CFIUS statute when other countries, particularly China, just because most of the cases were China, would say it was not really a national security tool. It was really a trade protectionist tool to keep foreign interests out of the US economy. I actually don't believe that's true of the way CFIUS was used. That's how it was perceived. I think if you look at the way both the ZTE issue and the Huawei issue have been handled, those issues have been confused. And I think it is a very dangerous thing when your own description of what you're doing with a national security tool can be undermined by your own actions and words of what you're doing with economic policy negotiations. I think in general, there's a question on sanctions, which is, this was raised with me by virtually every allied country, either at the finance minister or the head of state level, questioning the extraterritorial reach of US sanctions. I could look them all in the eye and say, we only enforce the law in the United States. You break the law in the United States, we have the right to take action. As long as you're settling transactions in dollars, on the cases where we use secondary sanctions, we can go at activities that happened outside of the United States, transacted in our currency. It really matters whether the basis for doing that is defensible, whether you've at least convinced other countries of the merits of what you're trying to accomplish, they're never going to like it if you're taking action against their banks. Or your banks violated our laws not once, but twice and then a third time. This company knowingly violated our law. They shouldn't have done that. So it's not doing. It's not just the economic power; it's the moral power behind the use of the economic tool that really empowers you to take these kinds of actions. Now, what are the kind of consequences of overuse of economic tools, either in trade or in sanctions? I don't think they're immediate. And this is a kind of a subtle point in a world where we do things in nanoseconds. Talking about things that happen over decades seems quaint. But I think we have to realize that the post-World War II economic order that puts the dollar at the center of global commerce and gives us the extraordinary reach that we have is not some divinely ordained order. British sterling had that for, and I see signs that countries are trying to figure out how to build their plumbing not to be as dependent on the United States, not to be as susceptible to actions that they don't control. And I think you accelerate that when you create the sense that the actions the United States is taking are increasingly, if not increasingly difficult to compel others to see the logic of or the justification for. I think the migration from the dollar is not going to happen suddenly. You're seeing a little bit that countries are diversifying their baskets of reserves to have exposure to more currencies. You're seeing the development of settlement systems and the ability to trade without coming to the United States, either physically, virtually through the use of our currency. But they're very nascent. It's really the plumbing that's being built. I don't think it's in the interest of the United States to encourage other countries to build that plumbing, because someday, once the plumbing is known to work, instead of it being something that's 10, 20, or 30 years away, it can be accelerated dramatically. I think that there's probably in the background some inevitability that another currency will gain strength over time. I can't tell you today whether it's the euro or the RMB or the yen. Obviously, none are in a position to do it right now. It could be some global market basket of currencies that's created to be an alternative to virtual currency. There's all kinds of things that could happen. I don't think we are I don't think we're acting prudently if we assume that because since the end of World War II, there's been one reality, that reality will be in place forever. And I also think it's a mistake to think that we're a week or a month or a year away from that happening. So if you think in decades, if it was a 30 to 50 year phenomenon that we have potentially accelerated, I think that acceleration is a risk to our ability to use these tools and to defend our own security and to have the benefits that go from our very special and privileged place. I think that it's not likely to happen in single-digit years, but I don't. If you were to tell me that the pattern of our policies made this go from a 50-year to a 20-year or a 30-year problem, I would say that was very bad for our national interest. And that's not the way policy is usually debated, but I think it's the way to think about this.
I have a few more questions, but there are two questions coming in from faculty members that relate directly to that fact or that issue. So let me just ask a question coming from Professor Laura Greismer from the Eisenhower School. quoting, "Are you at all concerned that Russia and China's recent announcement of cooperation to denominate trade in currencies other than the dollar? Do you expect this will impact the strength of the US dollar or eventually supplant use of the dollar as the world's reserve currency?" And following on that is from College of Information and Cybersecurity faculty, Linda Jansen. "Are there realistically any alternatives to the US dollar as the world's international currency? Should the US be worried that the rest of the world will eventually abandon the dollar?"
So look, I tend not to think in extremes, and I try to avoid hyperbole. I don't think the dollar is in danger anytime soon of being the central currency in the world. I do think that there's going to be more and more experiments with non-dollar denominated transactions, more non-dollar denominated reserves, the ability to diversify exposure, and to build the plumbing so that if there's a moment when countries want to create some more distance, they have the ability to do so. You look at the special purpose vehicle that the Europeans were trying to put together to get around our reimposition of sanctions on Iran. It didn't work. It didn't work because ultimately all the parties decided they didn't want to risk a response from our government against them that would burden their economies in a way that hurt their businesses. Over time, there's a lot of other economies that are growing faster than the U.S. Population is growing faster in other places. I don't think it's a today versus tomorrow. I think you're just going to see, yes, you'll see more transactions denominated in euros and in RMB. I don't think Russian currency is particularly, a serious challenge right now. It's had a pretty tempestuous history over the last 20 years. The RMB is not ready to be the world's reserve currency, nor does China even want it to be, because it would expose China to a kind of transparency that it's not comfortable with in terms of its own policies and practices. But I think incrementally, the strengthening of the euro in the last few months, is a reminder that if Europe gets back on its feet economically and has a currency that the world is comfortable with as a close to zero risk place to put reserves, it will grow. So I think what you'll see is not that one of these other options replaces the dollar anytime soon. I think you will see gradual diversification, and I don't believe that there is another currency that's ready. I never like to win because everybody else loses. It's a pretty dangerous. I've been in the policy world for the better part of 40 years. I remember when everyone had it wrong about Japan taking over the world in the 70s. I remember, lots of the expectations that didn't come to pass about Europe. I think that we don't know what the next decades bring. You don't know which country or region is going to break through in a way that becomes more of a threat. And candidly, one of the things that underlies the U.S. position is not just our dollar and our economy, but it's the fundamental stability of our system. It's the fact that why is it no risk to hold dollars? It's of no risk because there's a sense of the band of economic exposure being tolerable, no fear that there'll be refusal to repay, and until very recently, no fear that our political system would be subject to the kind of dissolution that you see in other parts of the world. I don't think we're as strong in that regard as we were, 5 years ago. I think the world is looking at us and watching and worrying in a way that they haven't before. That comes into play too. That's not economic, but it's part of part of the calculus. And I hope that coming out of the Great Recession, we showed the world that even though the financial crisis began in the United States, we emerged stronger than everyone else because we used our policy tools effectively and we were growing when others were not. Coming out of the current crisis, I hope we can prove that again. I hope we're in a position to show that the United States has the resilience to warrant the confidence that it has. At a moment immediately when there's a search for a safe haven, I still don't think there's any competition to the United States. So this is all kind of speculation about what's over the horizon. But I think that's what you have to think about when you're protecting a strategic tool.
Mr. Secretary, it's been said that if you owe your banker $100, you're in trouble. But if you owe your banker $1 million, your banker's in trouble. Does the fact that China currently holds over $1 trillion in U.S. reserves, does that make the United States vulnerable to China?
So I've always thought it was a little overstated because it would be an act of colossal self-destruction for China to take its massive holdings of dollars and cause them to dramatically lose value. That's the illustration of your apocryphal story. We kind of had a natural experiment of what would happen if China, in a rather quick period of time, divested of U.S. securities. When China was defending the RMB, I don't remember the exact number, but their reserves went from roughly 4 trillion to roughly 3 trillion. And the bulk of the drawdown in reserves amounted to either selling or not rolling over U.S. securities. We didn't see any particular movement in the liquidity of or value of U.S. bonds. So it was kind of proof that the depth and liquidity of the market for U.S. Treasuries could handle a pretty big event. I mean, the reason I have this kind of at the top of my memory is there were other cases where we worried about large holders of U.S. bonds as a kind of foreign policy matter, making a similar judgment. And it was by analogy to the experience that we saw with China that we could fairly comfortably say it would not be very effective and it would be very self-destructive. Therefore, it's not very likely. Now, that doesn't always necessarily hold, but that was kind of what the world looked like when I was doing this, day to day. I can't say that it's exactly the same today. The event that I would worry about is kind of concerted action by allied interests who wanted to undermine the United States, who were willing to sacrifice a good deal of the value of their U.S. assets. It's a pretty strained example, but you could imagine, if several countries dumped their treasuries all at the same time, you could see the kind of, pressure on markets that could cause things to break. I don't see that as a very likely scenario. I think the interests are very disparate. It's not as if we have like-minded adversaries who have an equal ability to do that. And to the extent that we have countries that with that degree of exposure to dollars, it's not like an OPEC kind of situation where they meet and act in concert. So, theoretically, I could come up with a scenario of being exposed that way. In the real world, I don't think it's very likely. At least not in the current environment.
Let me go back to the question queue. We have a question. I'm going to abridge the question from Captain Bill Reed, U.S. Navy, who is an Eisenhower School student, who asks, what security risks would you see if a blockchain digital currency were to become accepted in the future that is something other than in the US dollar?
Look, I think that there are a lot of issues with cyber currency that are very significant. You know, I don't know that the principal one is the threat to the dollar as a reserve currency. I think the when I was at Treasury, it was a brand new issue. So we were trying to figure out, how do you think about kind of not stifling technology, but worrying about the things you should worry about. And it wasn't clear whether cyber currency was what it was. Was it money? Was it an investment? Did you treat it as one or the other? And we came up with an approach of how to do it. But what we focused on as being the principal risk was the risk that anonymous transactions could easily escape normal reviews that give us the ability to see malign activity, either criminal or terrorist kinds of activity. And we had to make sure that we worked to have a similar amount of visibility into something that by its basic nature was designed to be almost invisible. And I think that's a serious risk. And there's ways to deal with it, but it's a serious risk. I think the idea of a private blockchain kind of currency, kind of replacing the global world currencies, I've never thought that was very likely. I could be wrong, but I just think the risk of value loss in those currencies is great. It doesn't have the sovereign behind it. The closer you get to that, very small risk on value and a sovereign-like backing, the more risky it is, the more potential it is to gain that kind of use. I think if you were to see a group of sovereign nations come together and launch a joint cyber currency, one could imagine something like that having a different character. In a way, it goes back 75 years. When the IMF was created, John Maynard Keynes had a dream to have a replacement to, the reserves at the IMF. So it wouldn't be the dollars and the pounds and the rubles. It would be something that he called Bancor. It was kind of a global currency. The IMF system of special drawing rights is kind of a solution to the need to have there be a commonly denominated reserve for all the nations, but it's not a tradable currency. It does have the ability to be used to support economies, but it's not used broadly in commerce. There have been some suggestions, particularly from China, to think about using the special drawing rights at the IMF as a way to create something that could be closer to an international, a medium for international trade, if not an actual currency. We're a long way from there. But if you ask me, what do I see as the thing that I would think of that someday might be a competitor? It would be something in the 75 years or so of the IMF. We've never lost our special drawing rights. It's been pretty stable. There's been some interventions that have been, led to money not being repaid, but overall, we've gotten our money back for everything we've put in to the IMF. Which to me says, you have enough countries together, it can start to meet that stability test. It's a long way from there to having something that's an alternative currency for any kind of regular use. But just intellectually, that would be the thing that I would kind of look towards.
Sir, I'm going to go back to the question queue. A question from Ryan Monagle. As the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen testified that the national debt was a major national security threat. Since that time, under both Republican and Democratic administrations, we've more than doubled that debt and are now running trillion-dollar deficits. At what point does the U.S. exhaust its privilege of being the reserve currency holder?
So I think it's a good question, and I think one has to always think from the perspective of where the global economy is at the moment and what the likely risks on the horizon are. At the time when Admiral Mullen was speaking, we weren't in the middle of a pandemic, and we weren't at a time when the economy of the US and of much of the world had been shut down. I think at a moment like this, and I think this is a view shared by most economists of both parties and both political stripes, is that the far larger risk is an inadequate response, so that with the loss of economic power would undermine the strength of our economy going forward, which means our revenue base as well. So I think today, where we are today, I feel pretty confident that we ought to be spending the large amounts we are. Candidly, we should be spending more because there's going to be a situation that feels like a recession to many, many millions of people for some time to come. And I don't think it's the right time to worry about adding to our stock of debt. You know, if our debt is at 100 or 103% of GDP when this ends, I don't think that will make as much of a difference as, are we growing at a decent rate? Have we reduced unemployment? Are we back on our feet? I think the hard question comes when we're back on our feet. And I'm something of a dying breed because in both the Republican Party, where, you know, in my view, a very irresponsible fiscal policy was put in place in 2017, cutting taxes in a way that I don't think was well designed and not paying for it, it added several $1 trillion to our debt. On the Democratic side, there are many voices, I don't think most yet, saying to invest in the things that we need to rebuild our country, human capital and physical infrastructure. You know, we can borrow forever and we should spend what it takes. I actually think coming out of this crisis, we need to find our bearing again and ask, what is a sustainable fiscal policy? Sustainable is not an absolute. Sustainable at 4% interest is different than sustainable at 0% interest. You know, you can have a bigger debt stock and have current income provide you the ability to service it with very low interest rates. I, for one, think it's a mistake to think that interest rates are going to be near zero forever. So I think while you have near zero interest rates, you deal with the emergency. And then when you come out of it, we ought to be in a place where, except for emergencies, we at a minimum pay for what we're doing, so we don't make the situation get, you know, to be a bigger problem. I think we also have a need to deal with the funding of entitlement programs. There are different ways to do it. You know, you can do it by raising payroll taxes. You can do it by cutting benefits. You can do it by some combination of the two. But what we have to do is make sure Social Security and Medicare are fully funded. I think if you did that combination of things, pay as you go for new things after the crisis, and fix our entitlement programs, I have my own preference as to what the better way to do it is. I think that would be, on an intermediate basis, a positive step. I think we're a long way away from a debate about kind of broad deficit reduction beyond that. Partially because there's no voice for it from the traditional circles of fiscal discipline, which abandoned their ability to do it in order to put in place the tax cut I described. Ultimately, to deal with deficits requires a bipartisan approach. That's what we saw in the Bush administration and the Andrews Air Force Base negotiations. It's what we saw in the Clinton administration in the balanced budget agreement. is really very hard to do in a durable way. I can give you examples of one party doing it. In 1993, the Clinton economic program was done on a party line vote. That's the exception to the rule. Mostly these things have to be done in a way that has broad buy-in. And until we heal some of the political fissures and divisions, that's going to be hard to do. If I had my druthers, we'd be in an environment where after the crisis, you could have civil discussions about what are the investments we need, how do we pay for them, and how do we think about our entitlement programs. And I would move from there to a broader agenda of the long-term fiscal posture.
Thank you. We have a question from Professor Joseph Van of the Marshall Center in Germany. More and more, governments are focusing and enforcing anti-money laundering efforts and limiting the role of secrecy jurisdictions as a way to identify and prevent bad actors from hiding illicit money. Do you see this trend continuing with greater emphasis as we move into the future?
Yeah, I do. I took quite a number of steps in this regard, using a number of tools to be able to have transparency into what's called beneficial ownership. The way that you conduct business in secrecy, even within your own borders, is by having a shell entity set up so it's not clear who the real owner and user is. And real estate is frequently used for that purpose. And we took measures administratively to make that much harder in the jurisdictions where we thought it was happening the most. I think when you go to meetings at the OECD or the G20, where economic leaders, both at the head of state level and at the ministerial level, discuss these issues, beneficial ownership is a big deal. It's a way of avoiding tax laws. It's a way of evading detection of malign activities. And I do think there'll be growing interest in it. It's hard to do unilaterally because as long there's water runs downstream, and if you have a jurisdiction that will allow that water to pool up, it goes there. So it really takes a global effort, not just a national effort. And that takes having an approach to diplomacy, particularly economic and financial diplomacy, that builds the confidence and the ties to do hard things together.
We have a question from KH at Special Operations Command. What events, black swan or more importantly, gray rhino, could accelerate migration away from the US dollar as the world's reserve currency?
I have never been in the prediction business of apocalypses, and I don't think I'm going to start now. I've tried to describe the kinds of activities that I would be cautious about. I think a trade war where you're seen as the bully, sanctions where you don't have anyone with you and you appear to be acting, if not arbitrarily, highly willfully, create the sense of exposure to risk that leads to others ask the question, do we want to be dependent on this system and this economy? I'm not sure what is the tipping point right now. It's hard to imagine an immediate tipping point. I think the way we withdrew from the Iran Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action has left real damage. This week, the UN General Assembly is meeting, and we're at the UN seeking the implementation of a provision that I helped design, the snapback. I was very proud of the snapback. What the snapback said was if Iran breaks the deal, we, the United States, can guarantee that international sanctions will go back into place. And the way it works is a little complicated, but it means that it would take a vote of the UN to stop that. And we have a veto, so we could stop the efforts to stop it. I was very proud of it. It's how I defended the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action when I went to testify a half a dozen or more times before Congress. I said, this works. It was the farthest thing from anyone's imagination that the thing that would cause the snapback to be used would be the United States withdrawing, Iran waiting quite a long time, and then after we put sanctions back on them, when they didn't violate the terms of our agreement, they took steps to violate the agreement. I mean, that doesn't build confidence in the world. I mean, you know, when police do that, it's called entrapment. You know, it's not the way a great power should behave. We create a mechanism to stop a country from doing bad things, and then we take an action, you know, that many of us hoped Iran wouldn't violate the agreement until they knew whether or not there was some chance of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action being reinstated. I don't approve of them proceeding on the course they're proceeding on. I think it's a bad thing for Iran to have a nuclear program outside of the bounds of the JCPOA. I think the idea that they're looking at a negotiation where they have nothing to give back and we expect them to do nothing, that's a kind of odd way to handle international relations and economic and diplomatic encounters. The reason I'm telling this story is what kind of an action? I don't know how many times you get to do that before countries say we don't trust you anymore. You know, and you know, I think we can get through this. I think we'll get through it a lot better if we're back at a negotiating table with allies working on what comes next than if we're just throwing, you know, rhetorical rocks at every adversary we have and then throwing economic rocks behind them. You know, I think you need to have diplomatic engagement. Doing things that impose real pain in the absence of a serious diplomatic process it's hard when you're all standing on solid ground in terms of your position. But when you've taken an action that destabilized the status quo that you were trying to defend, the rest of the world does not look upon it as you're acting from the moral high ground. I think abandoning our claim to the moral high ground is very dangerous to the United States.
Mr. Secretary, can you talk a minute about the impact that secondary sanctions and tariffs also have had on our alliance and partner relationships?
Well, secondary sanctions are a particularly challenging tool because countries have a hard enough time accepting that you're going to take actions against their businesses when they're operating in the United States. But when they're operating outside of the United States and a transaction never comes into the United States, but it goes through a mechanism where it touches dollars at some point or touches somebody who touches the United States, that's when they start to see it as extraterritorial reach, saying we're not just making laws for ourselves, we're making laws for the whole world. I think we have to reserve the right to do that. I think to act against the most malign forces, we need to have that option. But as I've argued before, it's an option we should use sparingly. We should not jump to it. We should not do it without consulting with other countries. We should reserve the right to do it even if they object. I'm not about unilaterally, lowering our ability to defend ourselves and to put forth actions in our own interests. I do think that the more we deal with the global community as potential allies, certainly as parties of interest, the better off we are. And I would be sparing in my use of secondary sanctions. You know, trade, I think, falls into a different category. I mean, we have trade agreements. Every administration for the last 50 years has taken trade actions when we feel other countries have violated it. We're in a peculiar moment right now because we, the United States, have actually made it impossible for the adjudicatory bodies that resolve global trade disputes to work effectively because we won't fill seats on those bodies. We've taken positions that are questionable at best in terms of international trade regimes that we were the architects of. I think that we have every right to defend ourselves against dumping and unfair practices, but we need to be very careful about taking unilateral actions that are not consistent with principle. And we ought to also be mindful of the fact that things like tariffs are taxes. They're taxes on American businesses and individuals, and their principal effect is not on the countries that we're sanctioning, but it's on the United States. And I don't think the way the policies have been executed in the last 3 years conform to all the principles that I just described. And I think we're at a moment where the fiscal policies we have are going to drive up the need for the U.S. to borrow from international investors, including sovereigns. That is going to have the effect of making our balance of trade get worse because other people will be getting our dollars and buying things. I think we have to have the right objective in a trade negotiation, which is fair trade. It's not just flows. It's not just, can we eliminate a surplus? Can we eliminate a balance of payment deficit? We've confused a lot of issues over the last few years, and I don't think it's an accident that the result has not been more but less manufacturing jobs, in some key industries. So it's not particularly effective. It may feel good because it looks like you're lashing out, but the real measure is effectiveness and is it advancing our interests? I think there are problems with the WTO, and there's a need to have a lot of these issues kind of revisited, but it can't be with the U.S. It won't end well if it's with the U.S. being an outsider, feeling that it's the victim of all of these institutions. The negotiation over the Trans-Pacific Partnership would have given the United States access to the world's fastest growing markets with terms that were the best terms in terms of labor, environmental, human rights kinds of considerations that had ever been in a trade agreement. The fact that we walked away from that and that on a bipartisan basis, it has lost its appeal means that we're going to be losing share in those markets, and we're going to be the outsiders, coming in trying to do better in a system that we didn't build. If I had my druthers, we'd be writing the rules, not complaining about them.
Sir, we have a question from Joseph Votel, President and CEO of the Business Executives for National Security and former commander of Special Operations Command and Central Command.
I know General Votel. I don't see him, but it's good to hear his question.
His question is, how would you suggest we improve our strategic planning processes to ensure we bring all the elements of national power to addressing our interests?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And one of the things that I always appreciated was sitting around the table in the sit room. I actually felt that oftentimes it was the joint staff and the civilian leadership at the Defense Department who looked at some of the strategic trade-offs in the use of sanctions in a way that was more helpful to those of us trying to drive a strategic discussion than some of the kind of diplomatic representatives who wanted an immediate action and wanted to make an immediate mark. I think the question of the way I described the Russia sanctions, I mean, it was a pretty intense strategic discussion in the sit room that led to the decision to use the highly engineered approach. I think that's the right way to make decisions on using powerful tools that are the equivalent of weapons, and to think of them as just economic actions is a mistake. One ought to think about them. I don't mean to equate the use of economic tools with putting lives at risk in military conflict. It's very hard to compare. But as a strategic matter, to think of it as a finite amount of national leverage, that you use it in ways that either diminish it or enhance it. And you have to be careful to use it to accomplish goals in the right way in order to maintain those tools for future generations to have them. If you start to use it as if, in economic terms, it's free, it will diminish in terms of its effectiveness and ultimately its availability.
Do you have to take that, sir?
No.
I think we have time for one last question, which I'll give to Stephen Falk from the Eisenhower School. He asks, we talk a lot about how the great power competition with China is predominantly geoeconomic. With so many deep economic ties to China, how can we leverage our economic tools to enhance our competition against the more malign aspects of China's aspirations without causing damage to the productive aspects of our economies?
It's a good question. I think the reality is the U.S. and China are the two dominant forces economically and in terms of strategic interests in the world. China does a lot of things and will continue to do a lot of things that are not to our liking. Some of them affect our national interests more directly. Some of them affect our values more directly. I think the idea that we can be on a course of inevitable conflict is frightening, because that has both the risk of economic and political discord leading to military conflict. It also denies the reality that our economies are interconnected at this point, and unraveling them may be impossible without doing substantial harm. So the question is, how do you engage to make a difference? First, as you engage, you actually spend time developing relationships and understanding of each other so that you're in a position to know how to press your case to get results. Secondly, you have to prioritize. You can list 100 things that you want them to do differently, but there have to be some things that are the issues without which our relationship can't get better. There have to be the things we have common interests that we ought to work together on, even while we're disagreeing on other things. And then there's that kind of space where you have to be willing to agree to disagree on things that you can't change. And some of those are painful. I think it's important not to exaggerate. It's important not to demonize. And I think there's some danger that the relationship is getting to the place where on both sides that's happening. To me, that increases the chance of conflict, which would not be in anyone's interest or in the world's interest. I don't think we have the option of taking a kind of backseat and saying we're not going to comment on anything that China is doing militarily or economically or in terms of human rights. You know, I was proud that my engagement with the Chinese, I made 13 trips to China as Treasury Secretary, more than any other country. I was able to make real progress on a lot of really important issues. You know, when I left the Treasury Department, it was the first time in a generation that people weren't saying that the exchange rate was being used, you know, unfairly. And we were able to get agreements, you know, to open some key markets and to have an understanding on some key areas of intellectual property. We didn't solve all the problems. There were many problems remaining. I think that is an approach that is not in favor nowadays, you know, because it is seen as not being, you know, hard enough, not strong enough. I think strength is about moving the two countries in a place where more of our interests are in a place that is both more consistent with our values and our security, and the risk of outright conflict is being minimized and managed. So I'm a little bit old school. I never thought that China was going to be a Jeffersonian democracy. I think, you know, the idea that you know, there's a Communist Party in China that's a powerful institution is not new. It was true when Nixon went to China, and it is true today. But that doesn't mean that the things that government has to do have to offend as many interests as they do today. And we have to be able to talk to them about hard things. You know, and right now, I don't actually think we can talk to them about a lot of hard things. They view the language coming from our government as being nothing short of racist. They view it as being inconsistent with the position in the world that China has grown to. And I think they're having a moment of their own searching for their kind of nationalist direction. It's a tricky and dangerous moment. I would never say we ignore things that will require our attention. But I do think we have to find a way to engage more effectively than we are right now.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. There's still quite a few questions in the queue, but ladies and gentlemen, I want to be respectful of Secretary Lew's time. So we're going to wrap this up. Before we adjourn, I want to thank you again, Secretary Lew, for taking the time to help enhance our national security education. This has been a pleasure. I also want to thank my colleagues at the Eisenhower School for co-sponsoring this, particularly Sean O'Brien, Steve Brent, Walt Hudson, and Andy Lath, and also my partners at the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment, in particular Todd Veazey, Nicole Peterson, and Mariah Yeager. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you for your good questions, and please stay well, stay healthy, and stay in touch.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Nicole, for helping me navigate the technology hurdles to make this possible.
No worries. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your time today, and thank you, everyone, for tuning into this team session. Have a good day.
Stay well.